Another episode of Pulse of Polynesia, where we bring together inspiring voices from across the Pacific to share their journeys, wisdom, and stories that uplift and empower our people. I am Leaso Filoyali, coming to you live from Houston, Texas.
And Talofa, I'm Lina Famuina, coming to you from the beautiful state of Hawaii. Before we start this exciting journey, we would like to thank our team, Eileen Tumalu and Fufui Pitelo, for monitoring Facebook and YouTube. We would also like to thank everyone for tuning in to share our trials and triumphs together as an Ainga. Please use this opportunity to ask those burning questions that you'd like to know, but also please remember to keep it respectful. Just wanted to give everyone a heads up. I'm reading the comments via text messages and screenshots, so I'll be multitasking and looking off the screen here and there, but I am definitely paying attention.
Tonight, we are honored to welcome an extraordinary leader, advocate, and change maker, Susi Feltch-Malohifo'ou. Susie is the driving force behind Pacific Island Knowledge to Action Resources, an organization dedicated to eliminating violence, strengthening businesses, preserving Pacific arts, and providing life-changing support to our life preserving support to our communities. She leads K.A.V.A talks, empowering men to redefine masculinity and end violence, while also pioneering Pe'au, a platform uplifting Pacific artists and filmmakers. Tonight, we'll discuss violence in our community, the intersectionality of Polynesian culture and assimilations, and the culture norms that shape our silence. But beyond her advocacy, we dive into her personal journey, the roots, struggles, and experiences that shaped her into this fierce, compassionate leader she is today. Get ready for an evening filled with powerful insights, resilience, impactful discussions that sheds lights on important issues within our community. Susie, welcome to the hot seat.
Thank you, ladies. I am very privileged to be here this evening.
We are so excited to have you, Susie. I am, first of all, let me give a shout out to Sulu out there for getting you on our podcast. This is such an amazing platform to be able to have someone, especially as you, to share what you're going to share with us tonight. So thank you so much again, Susie, for coming on here. And thank you, Sulu.
No, thank you. I love the referral. I just wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement and just to acknowledge that the land that we're on, that we recognize that the land we're speaking from is the traditional homeland of indigenous people who have stewarded this land for generations. So in Utah, we acknowledge the Shoshone, the Ute, the Goshute, Paiute, and Native people who continue to live and thrive here. And in Houston, Texas, we acknowledge the Karankawa, Atacapa Ishka, and the Kohuli Takan people, the original stewards of that land. And across the United States, we honor the indigenous caretakers of this land, and we recognize that many Pacific Islanders now live on indigenous lands. And as Pacific Islanders, we understand the deep ties between land, ancestry, and identity, and we stand in solidarity with indigenous communities everywhere in the fight for sovereignty, land rights, and the cultural preservation. And this is not really is just not words, but it is a commitment to action, education, and respect for indigenous communities past, present, and future. So I thank you for allowing me to give the land acknowledgement. I think as cultural practitioners that we need to remember that this land is Native American land. And just like in our Pacific Island countries, when we would go to some, we would also ask if we can be here and be appreciative of their land. So I always like to give acknowledgement to the Native Americans. And so who am I and why does this conversation matter? And I'm going to say that I'm a proud Tongan woman, trans, racial adoptee, socialized white, and a lifelong advocate for justice and inclusion. I do serve as the co-founder and currently the Chief Development Officer of PIK2AR, Pacific Island Knowledge to Action Resources, where we do empower communities with personalized support, fostering self-reliance, and removing barriers linked to social determinants of health. And I believe that everybody can win. And we will win if given the proper resources in the proper way with culturally relevant support and wraparound services to thrive. And so tonight, I'm really honored to join the Pulse of Polynesia podcast for a really powerful and I think very necessary conversation. And I asked myself, why is this conversation is important? And we often talk about culture, our pride, our strengths, but we don't always talk about the issues that we face behind closed doors.
Mhm.
And violence, trauma, and unaddressed pain impact us individually and as families and as people. If we don't talk about generational trauma, mental health, and healing, we're just going to keep those repeating the cycles. So, but I think the good news is that our ancestors have always given us the answers. Our traditions, our values, and our community ties hold that key to our healing. I do also want to say that there's a trigger warning and disclaimer here that
Mhm.
some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today will be triggering. And if anytime you need to take a break, step away from your computer, your phone, and process in your own time, that's okay. Now, this discussion is definitely from my perspective and lived experience, and I acknowledge that every person's experience is different. I want to say that our parents did the best that they could with the knowledge and resources they had. This is not a conversation about blame, but about learning, healing, and growing together. So, we're going to discuss options tonight, some ideas, but the idea is that you drive what's best for your family. You take the good, leave the rest.
Mhm.
And in order to make sense of many of these things, I thought I'd start with where are we in the United States as
Mhm.
people? And then some cultural norms that may affect and be changing because we don't live in our home countries. Um, and how did we get in, before we get to discussing domestic violence and sexual assault and bullying, um, and suicide. So if we just take the information, you know, what do you think are some of the barriers our community faces today? And how do you think that loss of language affect our identity and the way we learn? What do you ladies have any thoughts about that? What are the biggest barriers? And the loss of language, how does that affect our identity?
I think a lot of it has to do with with the upbringing. There's not enough communication. There's not enough. We're too caught up with the change in life right now in this day and age. We're not trying to hold on to what we've. It's kind of like an example of a person going to church, right? You could take your child to church as much as you want, but if that child has a family of their own and they don't take their child, then that continues to go on. You just start to lose that tradition. And
Yeah,
so I feel like that's kind of similar case with our culture. We start to lose little by bits as the generation starts to grow.
yeah. Especially when we don't live in our countries, right?
Yes.
Yes, yes, yeah, and that's one thing too. I think one of the barriers is that um, when we are removed from our culture ties and then placed into, like, say, the Americanized way or another way of life, you have a challenge, right, to say, do I do this because I know this is in my culture, so what I should do, or do I fit in and go with the flow because I'm trying to live in this world of not understanding that, you know knowing yourself. You have, know yourself well enough to say, like, no, that's not something that I would do or believe in, because in culture we believe in a lot of things. We believe in God, we believe in a certain way, the way you walk, the way you stand, the way you talk. Once you realize that you believe in that, you're not speaking for yourself, that you're speaking for your family and your village or your peoples, then that gives you a different perspective of, maybe I shouldn't, right? But then
Yeah.
also, like, trying to fit in. So it's a lot of things behind that. And also, like you said, the loss of language, right? Understanding that back in the days when our people did come to the United States, they actually had them stop speaking the language, right? They didn't want them to have that accent. So, right. So you have generations that the language has been lost. But in this day, age, and time, now the kids are saying, like, I want to know my language, right? I want to know my language. I want to know my people. And then, sorry, the hard part is, then we have our own people who are saying, like, oh, you're plastic, you know oh, you're not speaking it right and making fun, right? So then you're like, what? I'm trying to It's not my fault that I don't know it, but I'm trying to rectify it and trying to understand it. Why are you guys?
You know
Hmm.
what's funny about that is the older people shouldn't say anything because it's their fault because they didn't teach it, right? It's not
Right.
the youth,
Yes.
right?
Yes, yes.
So if
But
you think that the
Mhm.
kids don't know how to speak and they're plastic, that responsibility fell on the older adults, the
Yes.
older generation. right?
Yes, but they should take
So
it more as inviting. Like, why do people look down on people that are trying to learn the language or trying to understand their culture, right? Why do we point our finger and it's like, oh, it's like, why that? We should be more inviting to say,
they're
I'm
trying.
so glad you're trying to learn. Right, right. Like they teach other languages in schools to have people embrace, Spanish, French, right? So it's like you should be proud when someone of your culture wants to learn it, you know.
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to share some statistics about Pacific Islanders here in America. So there's 1.6 million Pacific Islanders that live in the United States. 40% of 40 growth. We had a 40% growth from 2010 to 2020. Now, you know that these numbers, it's way higher because these
Mhm.
numbers are based on the census. Half
Yeah.
of our people don't open the door. We're not answering anything. And so those numbers are probably very low in comparison. Um, the majority reside in Hawaii, California, Washington, Utah, Texas, and Alaska.
Mhm.
13.5% of Pacific Islander families live below the poverty line. And just to share with you that the poverty line for a single individual is $15,650. For a family of four, it's $31,200, which means that 22% of Pacific Island children live in poverty, which is twice the national child poverty rate of 10%. That's what the average is, but we are at 22%. Our education, 19.6% of Pacific Islanders hold a bachelor's degree or higher. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit here. Health disparities, high rates of diabetes, hypertension, mental health struggles. Incarceration in Hawaii, they're 4 times higher than the non Pacific Island whites. Homelessness, Pacific Island rates in California are 7 times higher than the US average. I know here in Utah, 6% of the homeless are Pacific Islanders. 6%, right?
Wow.
Homelessness crisis, only 50% of Pacific Islanders own their own homes compared to non-Hispanic whites. And that just tells you kind of the state of where we are. A lot of people think our community is doing just fine. But based on the data, I would say that we're not doing just fine, that we can do better. To have 22% of our children being raised in homes that make less than 30,000 for a family of four, you can't even eat on that, right? So I wanted to talk about some cultural norms and how they affect positively. And the first one was reciprocality and our collective society. And when you think about what reciprocality, it's a core value of Pacific Islanders, right? What you give to the community gives back. And traditionally, Pacific Islanders, we've lived in a collective society. We've been very independent, interdependent societies where everyone contributed to the village and no one was left behind.
Mhm.
And that cultural reciprocality, it builds our identity. I mean, the oldest child takes responsibility for the younger siblings.
Yes.
Yeah.
Families share financial resources, ensuring that collective survival, everybody survives. Brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, grandparents, right?
Mhm.
There is a community care that's prioritized over individual success. Now, I think that we can take that to the next level, right? Where it's not healthy. So, but what happens when reciprocality is lost in our communities? And I think we see that as nowadays, as we live outside of our countries, is how does that, well, now what happens when we lose reciprocality in this country? We shift from being interdependent to individualism, right? Because in
Yes.
America, the Western norm is to prioritize individual success over the collective. But when that's the case, it weakens our community ties. And so another thought that I had is about losing reciprocality is it leads to increased isolation among our elders and our youth because we've been used to being the family collectively together. But if you break that apart and you're just one single family, elders and youth then are increased in isolation. And then we have more financial pressures on individuals to support the extended family because nobody's giving collectively, right? So you may have one sibling that's trying to help all the siblings financially, and one sibling or two siblings trying to help mom and dad and grandpa out, right? Because we've lost that idea. And I think that the loss of cultural values emphasize sharing, how we serve each other, and then the love of extended family, without that community reciprocality, right? We lose some of those cultural values. So I thought to myself, what's the cost of losing that village mindset? What are we seeing here in America? When we lose that village, we lose our safety net. You think about that. It's always been our safety net. So without interdependence, Pacific Islanders, in when we don't live in our home countries, we experience higher stress levels, right? As the responsibility shifts to individuals, we used to have a community to shoulder those problems with. Now we just have ourselves and maybe our spouse. And so the stress level increases, right? And then increase financial hardships because we have fewer people that are putting into those resources to share in the
Right.
responsibility.
I wanted to make a comment on that, but
Yeah,
before I do, since Sarah has a message, it says, "Go, Susie, finding a sense of belonging in spaces we occupy, especially if we're not connected to our own culture or raised in it, but know it is who we are and it will never go away because it's in our DNA." Right,
correct.
and that is so true, right? That's what we spoke about, right? Like we are of the same people, right?
Yeah,
And then like you're saying, it's, it kind of reminds me of the scenarios where saying back home, um in a home, right, we have all these people to feed, but still someone from neighbors, right, they can come over, right, and it's just, and no worries, like, come, right, if whatever little or much that we have, we will share, right? But and it gets lost because when you come to the mainland, right, financially people are like trying to live and survive, right? So then it becomes harder to say, yes, I can feed, everybody, and be that, have connection for everyone. So yes, I totally agree with that,
and
losing
then
that.
we start thinking about pride. Well, all I have is some bread to bring. Oh, but that's all I have. I'm embarrassed. I won't bring the bread because I don't have a roasted pig to bring,
Right.
right? And
Yes,
it's
yes.
that that's not even what reciprocality is about, right?
Mhm.
It's not
Mhm.
about monetarily things, but we've kind of
Right.
shifted in America what
Yeah.
reciprocality is. We have it weakens our cultural identity
Yeah.
as Western values start to replace what
Mhm.
traditional reciprocality is, because then money becomes more important. Whoever
Mhm.
brings the money to the table has more value than the person that came with open heart and hands just to help with the work,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
So I think that's one of the things. And I always ask, how can we preserve reciprocality in a modern world? How do we do that? And I think that we need to rebuild our collective mindset, change it. We need to teach our youth that success is not just individual. Our success is collective.
Mhm.
We are as proud as our nieces and nephews, as somebody in our family, aunt and uncle, that have a win. We should celebrate them all, right?
Yes.
Instead of like, oh, my daughter's better than yours. My
Yes.
son made 3 touchdowns, yours only made 2. Like, that needs to just stop, right? That's
Yeah.
that white culture that's coming and infiltrating us, instead
Mhm.
of us each celebrating our family members for their successes.
Mhm.
I think another thing is we can reinforce the idea that community care is cultural wealth. That is an asset
Yes.
that we have, right? If we don't use it, if we don't care for it, that cultural wealth is going to go away.
Yeah.
Um, and I think creating modern villages through cultural organizations, through family networks, mentorship programs, whatever that looks
Mhm.
like to keep the culture alive, I think are some ways that I've been thinking about how we can rebuild that collective mindset. And how do we get back to that? Um, any more thoughts on that? Because I'm going to move on to my next cultural norm.
I
Well,
just wanted to mention last, I think it was weekends ago, we had someone, sorry, I can't remember her name, but she was on here, right? So she was in the mainland, she moved back home, and her and her husband did a volleyball traveling team, right? Which is so important and be crucial because back home you don't get the exposure they can, right? So they believed in bringing the kids out to play volleyball here, get seen by coaches, and then she said her and her husband's thought was that if they can help one child get into college and become successful, they will come back home and take care of their family, and that ties in exactly to what you're saying, right? Is they could just have taken care of their own kids and made them successful, but they had that mentality of, we're taking the whole village, whoever makes it out will come back and continue that prosperity process. So
and for
yes.
women, if you help a woman, that's generations to come because she's going to have
Yes.
children,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yes.
those new mindsets and those new things she's going to pass on, healthy relationship, healthy things that she's learned. So yeah, totally. That's just one thought, because as we get to domestic violence, thinking about how that collective society, right? How that
Mm-hmm.
hurts us and how that helps us. The next one is our connection to our land and that placenta burial tradition that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we lose our land, when we come from our islands and we come here, you may buy a house, but you don't own that house. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to still pay taxes the rest of your life, even if you paid it off. You don't
Mm-hmm.
pay the taxes, that house is gone,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right? And so when we lose that connection to our land, what does that mean to our identity? Because when
Yeah.
we live, when we're back home, everybody knows whose house is where. Everybody knows what
Mm-hmm.
villages their
Mm-hmm.
families are from, generation after generation. So
Yes.
we lose that identity from that village and the land, right? And I think that
Yes.
our connection to the land is sacred, but we lose that connection to land in America because we don't really own the land. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we couldn't plant our placentas in our land right now if we wanted to because they take it at the hospital, right?
Mm-hmm.
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 I don't know if anyone's ever asked for their placenta, but I mean, the idea is it ties the children back to their land and their ancestors, right? And that tradition is not just physical, but it's a spiritual connection, a
Yes.
way to say, you belong here. This is my
Yeah.
land, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because part of me is buried in this land. And this land will always recognize me because my placenta is here. This is my family roots and my ancestors, my mom and dad. And so you think about the food we eat, the kava we drink, the trees that give us shade, all come from that same soil that has absorbed our generations, right? Of our placentas. And so I think leaving our lands has a really deep psychological and spiritual impact us that we may not even recognize. May not even recognize that. But I promise you, when we go home, we recognize our land. We recognize our family land, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that feeling
Mm-hmm.
when you go home, I know when I get that feeling when I go back to my village, I'm like, I'm home. There's
Yeah.
just a different feeling, right? And we don't get that same feeling when we come back to America, to our house. It's
Mm-hmm.
not that same feeling. But we've lost, when we lose our land like that, because we've come here, we lose these traditions and identity to land. And so I asked myself, how do we reclaim that with our connection, right?
Yeah.
And I've thought about that. In Hawaii, they do great, right? You guys have the ocean still there. You're cleaning the lake. You're cleaning the water. We practicing stewardship wherever we are. I've been working on a project here in Utah, and kind of the tag of it is the Moana starts at the top of the mountains because all water is connected.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we understand that we're protectors of the Pacific Ocean, if the Moana starts at the top of the mountains here where we live in Utah, we have a responsibility to make sure that that water is clean, and because it's going to flow down into the Pacific Ocean. And so and that's part of some of the work that I've been looking at is how do we become better land stewards? And what we do here in Utah affects what happens in the waters in Hawaii, affects what happens in the waters in Samoa and Tonga. And I think that we have forgotten to teach that to our children, that the importance behind those generational ties to our land. Half of our kids won't even ever go back and see that land, right?
Yeah.
They won't even see their generational lands. Um, and so, that's, I think that our connection to the land is sacred. And that bond that we have, but I think we've all lost it. I even see for myself, it is lost that idea of sand and water and making sure that the garden is taken well. We don't even garden, do we? I mean, I know I don't garden, but when we're home, we do, right?
Mhm.
We
Yeah.
live off the land. And so I say that this possession of land is a possession of identity, right? Um, and then I'm gonna any thoughts, because I know that's probably far fetched for some people, but I think you get it,
Hmm.
right? That land connection that we've always had. Um,
And
Now
we
let's
have a
talk about the loss.
question. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. So we have a question. What are your thoughts on some American Samoa citizens wanting to be citizens automatically?
yeah. I honestly feel like they should be, because they are like American Samoan. But the other part of me says, I wish Samoa would break away from America,
Mm.
right? Is
Mhm.
that um, I hate to see, um, I don't know, that, I mean, that's just my personal thoughts, right? I feel like if they're going to have the flag of America, they should be automatically citizens of it and have the same rights as every other American. But on the other flip side of that is, if I was American Samoans, I wouldn't want to be American. I'd want to have my own country back. Um, yeah. Well, thanks for the question. Um,
Yeah,
I- the
online.
next cultural norm is the loss of language and the impact that has on our learning. And
Mhm.
so we understand that written language came with colonization. And before that, we were an oral society. So we passed down knowledge and genealogy down through storytelling at family events.
Hmm.
That's why our kids are so boring. They don't understand the language, so they don't understand the genealogy, right? They don't understand the storytelling when we've lost our language. And there are just some things, that can't be translated.
Mhm.
They don't even have words for it or meaning. They're lost in English. Um, but because we were an oral culture, we learned by watching and doing. But
Hmm.
in schools, the American system uses a very different learning method. We start learning at a really young age to code switch. We are expected to live by one set of cultural norms at home and then a different set at school, at work, and in public spaces.
Hmm.
And so our culture and identity, there's that saying that says our culture and identity are non-negotiable. No matter where we live and how we dress or what language we speak, our genealogy, traditions, and cultural values remain at the core of who we are. And just because you don't speak the language doesn't mean you're less Samoan or less Tongan,
Mhm.
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
And I think it often that happens, and people say that
Mhm.
because I don't know how to dance Tongan, or because I don't know how to speak Tongan, I'm less Tongan. And then it makes, I mean, I grew up feeling like I was like an imposter Tongan. And that's not true, because the blood that runs through our kids' veins
Mhm.
is Polynesian.
Yes.
Even if you have 1 ounce of it,
Hmm.
that's enough. You don't have to be able to speak the language. You don't have to do any of that, right? And I
Mhm.
think that that's a message that we could help our young realize, that they're enough. They're enough just the way they are. Um, and I think communication came up, right? We talked about,
Yes.
so how does the way we communicate in our culture shape how we navigate American systems?
Mhm.
How does the way we communicate in our culture shape how we navigate American spaces?
It's really tough, like having to merge both different types of culture, American and our Polynesian. it doesn't really sink, 100%. And the reason why I say that is because I noticed me coming to America being a culture shock when I first came to live in America. I had to change the way I am. I had to change certain types of my upbringing, and then that carried on to raising my kids a different way, to be able to allow them to merge the way they need to in the American society.
Yeah.
And
To
so,
assimilate.
yeah. So the communication part was more of, I for me having to raise in Samoa, but coming here raising my kids in America. That was my fault to not be able to teach them more of the cultural side, because I was too afraid that they weren't able to mend well with the American society.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I mean, we're not blaming. We're not going to let you blame yourself and shame yourself. Parents do the best they can with what they're working with. So please do not feel, inadequate over
mhm,
that. You did the best you can, and you do that every day with your children. So if we look at how Polynesians communicate, it's very indirect, right?
mhm,
Um, and it's always rooted in respect. There's a lot of nonverbal gestures, eyebrows, silence, facial expressions. They carry so much meaning when we speak to each other, right? We are taught to first process, and then probably never respond, right? We
yes.
we just listen and we process and don't respond. Speaking too much or too boldly can be seen as disrespectful, especially
Mhm,
to elders. Um, Boasting about your achievements or strengths is frowned upon. We're taught to be humble and let others speak for our abilities, but we aren't to ever talk about how good we are at something. And then conflict resolution is often done through actions rather than words, right?
mhm.
Because we don't know how to communicate to say I'm sorry, but we'll go buy something and give something to something or do something without actually saying I'm sorry,
Yeah.
right? We just know that's what our parent meant or our spouse meant without actually, and we give them that grace. So these verbal negotiations or self advocacy can feel really unnatural, um, to us in the American context, right? So
Mhm,
if we switch over and look at American communication, it's rooted again in individualism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Be all you can be,
yes.
clear, articulate. They debate, they verbal assessive. I mean, they assert themselves verbally, and it's looked at as valued. Not so much in our culture, right?
Yes.
If we were to debate or were like assertive verbally, and so then you look in workplaces and schools, Polynesians may be seen too quiet or
Yes.
not very confident,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
simply
Timid.
just because they're practicing cultural humility,
Yes.
Can I
right?
just add something to
Yeah.
this? So, when I was in college, the professor had asked all of us a question, and none of us Polynesian kids answered. It was always the Balangis, the white kids, and other cultures that spoke. But us Polynesians, we were just quiet. We were just sitting there like we're not going to speak until we're asked to speak.
Right,
And
right.
so it didn't hit me until, or any of us, until the professor said, "This is what I was talking about. You guys need to speak up. This is not, we're not in your island. We are in America. You need to talk."
But I mean, that's easier said than done when you've lived your whole life and you
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
haven't been able to talk. And then you get to college or high school and they expect you to talk,
Right.
right? You don't have those skills
Mhm,
to be able to communicate, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and then the expectation in American culture is to advocate for yourself, to
mhm.
negotiate, to debate. Um, and it feels really unnatural for
Yes.
us. It almost feels like we're being rude, disrespectful, defiant to authority, right?
Mhm.
But look at how that impacts a job interview or career advancement,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the American workplace, people self promote themselves, they say how great they are. If you've ever interviewed people, They tell you how great they are, and then they start job, and then they're not great at all, right? And we seem to be the opposite, right? We
Yes.
don't sell ourselves, then we get the job, and we do a wonderful job.
Mm-hmm.
But we
Yes.
don't do well in selling ourselves in job interviews. We don't do well in articulating and saying, I'm really good at this, and I accomplished this. I got this award.
Mm-hmm.
We're
Yeah.
not good at negotiating pay raises or promotions to ask your boss for a job. We think, and we've been socialized to think, if we just do a really good job, somebody's going to give us a raise and a promotion,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And many of us, through the corporate world that we've been in, have been overlooked
Mm-hmm.
for raises, for jobs, and then we've been butthurt about it, right?
Yeah.
Because you should see me, I do this. But unless we promote ourselves, right? The other thing is we don't speak up about workplace issues, advocating for if there's your leader is not doing the best job. We're just going to take it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, what happens when cultural humility meets American individualism? When those two things come together, right? What are the effects of our culture norm? So, while humility is respected in our Polynesian communities, it can be misinterpreted as a lack of confidence or leadership in American workplaces,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
right? And many Pacific Islanders do not receive the job offers or the career advancements simply because they struggle to express their skills in a way that aligns with American hiring norms,
Yes.
Yes.
right? So you can see how communication affects in other areas, right? And in relationships. Employers might assume that the applicant who does not confidently describe their achievement isn't qualified, even if they have the skills, because they can't verbalize it, right? And then
Yes.
we take this to personal relationships. Many Polynesians struggle with expressing emotional verbally, and it leads to misunderstandings, especially when we have American born friends and partners. Feelings of frustration, resentment, or isolation can build because we don't have the language to express our needs. We're very quick to the fist when we're mad, instead of sitting down and saying, I feel this because you did this.
Or their sarcasm. It's just ridiculous. I mean, that's a
Yes.
big part of our Polynesian people. We're very sarcastic.
And usually they mean it, right? Like if a
Yes.
Polynesian woman said to me, oh, your hair looks cute, I'd probably go in the bathroom and look at my hair. It's like, oh, what's wrong with it?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Or if they said, oh, you look really cute in that dress, you'd be like, okay, what is she
Mm,
really trying to say?
yes.
Trying to say something else, right? So
Yes.
you see that our communication is indirect, right? Because we don't say directly. And then
Hmm.
when we don't say it directly, we mistrust what the other person tells us, right? So how do we bridge this gap? How do we teach ourselves and our youth to be better communicators? How do we code switch? How do we be respectful in one culture and be respectful and advocate for ourselves, right? Because there's a time and a place to be humble, but
Hmm.
there's also a time and a place to speak up.
Yes.
Because there, I think that code switching and learning both communication skills and when to use them allows us to navigate in these systems without losing our cultural identity.
Hmm.
And I feel like we don't feel like we're a sellout when we code switch. We're doing this because that's how we need to operate over here. And then when we come home or when in our own community, we switch back to what we know and is respectful. Because if you try to cross those, you're going to be disrespectful in both cultures,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So it's
Right.
important that we learn both and when to use it and when not to use it.
Yeah, I was gonna just say that because we also had one of our classmates, Sivai Law, and I remember her
Hmm.
name, so she's our classmate, right? And she touched on that. She spoke about being a pastor's daughter, right? Have
Yes.
wearing a mask, and then leaving Samoa, joining the military, and then how she raises her daughters, who are Afakasi too, but teaching them that be respectful, giving them a voice to say that I'm going to raise you. The culture way is respect, right? So know the place and the time, and to say what you need to say, and be respectful about it. Because I think if we think and hold on to that, right, as long as it's respectful, right, I'm gonna um say my qualifications, to be confident in it and be respectful about it, right, and not be overly boisterous about myself, in that kind of way, right, because then you come across a different way.
Yeah.
you know it's the time, the place, reading the room, knowing, so that you don't have to code switch, just knowing where you're at, the people, the audience, and speaking your truth in that respectful way. It helps you to keep both sides, right? Your culturally, you are being respectful, and then in the society that you are placed in, you still are respectful of it in their ways.
Mhm.
So
Correct.
yes, very,
Yeah.
So
very good
real
point.
quick to add to it, I
Oh,
noticed that when, like, even for myself and a lot of people that I've come across that are in the islands and here, I noticed that like our people, when we don't speak up, and then when we finally decide to speak up, we come across too loud. We come across in a very our sound of trying to express it becomes too, to other people, they're gonna look at us like, wow, they're too aggressive, but they're
Arrogant.
not, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
we Julia online comments, public speaking is not a course offered in schools on island. However, it is a skill that can be learned and cultivated over time, and it needs to be more encouraged by parents to their children, so it becomes a social norm.
Yes, for sure.
Yes,
Yeah. If we're going to
definitely.
live outside of our culture and in other
Hmm.
countries, then
Yes.
we also be able to adapt and learn temporarily when we're in those spaces. We're not sellouts. We're not whitewashed. If
Yeah.
we do this, it's just temporary while we are in this situation. And all of these things I want to say to address violence and mental health and community well-being, right? Because all of those things we talked about in our cultural norms affect the whys about violence. So, how does violence, whether inside or outside our home, um, shape your experiences? And how does unaddressed trauma affect families in our community, do you think? How does
There's
violence shape our experiences? And how does unaddressed trauma affect our families?
there's a lot of trust issues growing up, you know. There's a lot of not holding putting a guard up, and not being able to really be you, and then you carry that on to your kids, because then your kids are not able to see their mom 100%, and being more protected of the kids in a sense where you know, you don't want them to go through what you're going through, but at the same time they really can't be the way they need to be because mom is a certain way, you know. I don't know if I'm explaining that well,
Yeah,
but
is mom dealing with trauma
Yeah.
herself?
yeah.
Right,
Right.
right. And like I love hearing these stories. So then I keep speaking about our prior, people that were on, but Stacia was just on, right? And she had said she'd gone through that growing up. Like her mom used to beat her, right? But if Phil used to beat her, like that's the way it goes in generations, right? You beat your kids, and then they beat their kids, and then it goes on, right? And then she said when she had her daughter, like it started out where that's all she knew, but then she realized that she had thought, how can like God bless you with someone, with your child, and and say that this is how you love them, by beating them or hurting them, right? And it changed the way that she communicated with her daughter. Like she spoke to her more, and like broke that chain of communication, of way, instead of beating them, talk to them, uh, reach out in other ways. So and I think that is important, because like Lasso said, right, once we do speak, once the Samoan or the Polynesian person speaks, right, all they knew was, or all they hear a lot of is the yelling or the anger, right? So it comes out in a different way, right? Oh, I didn't mean
Yeah.
to raise my voice, right? But
Yeah.
not knowing how to communicate, is a thing.
But I was just going to say that the definition of domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behavior in a relationship used to gain power and control over an intimate partner. So, right, domestic violence is about power and control, and it starts long before the physical violence. It includes verbal abuse, financial control, emotional manipulation, and isolation, way before the black eye. And I think we can see those signs when we if we maybe I can come back and we can dive deeper into the power and control wheel, and you can start seeing when it's usually the first step is verbal abuse. You're ugly, shut up, all of those things. And then when that stops working for them, then that's when the physical, right, the emotional manipulation. And then sexual assault and incest. Sexual assault is sexual contact without explicit consent, and incest is sexual abuse within a family. It's a form of generational trauma that's often not talked about in our communities. And then the other item I had was bullying and suicide in our Pacific Island communities. Pacific Island youth experience higher rates of bullying due to their cultural identity, body size, stereotypes, and racial discrimination. Suicide is the leading cause of death among Pacific Island youth ages 12 through 19. And many of our youth don't ever seek help because mental health is stigmatized and they don't have culturally relevant resources to go to. And so, you ask yourself, what's moving forward? What are those strategies so that we can change that?
Mm-hmm.
How do we um, change that? And the first thought is we've created safe spaces for these conversations. This podcast is a safe place, is a platform for individuals, families, and communities to learn and be educated and to hear stories. Um, what's the one thing you can think of that we could do today to move our community forward around domestic violence and sexual assault?
This, sharing your story so that people can hear it. They can know that, see the outcome, that it is going to be okay, right? Offer hope,
Yeah,
offer like what you have, resources.
yeah,
you know it gives hope to the person that's going through it, that thinks there's no other way out, or there's nothing else to do, or this is where I'm supposed to be. Like, it opens it up. You sharing your story, everyone's sharing their story so that they can hear it. Like, it's going to be okay, but
yeah.
you have to take that step. You have to go beyond praying and take that step.
And I
you
think
know
also too, hearing people's stories like, oh, I'm not the only one.
yes.
Oh, I thought that isolation is real. We think we're
Mm-hmm.
the only one that's going through it. And when we
Mm-hmm.
hear other people's stories, so podcasts like this are very important, so that the women and men that are out there, youth can say, oh, this is not right. Often when we are in domestic violence, sexual assault, we think it's right. We think that's what we deserve, right? And so breaking that silence on violence and mental health and trauma is vital. It's like the first step, right? Is being able to tell your story. I mean, encouraging people to get culturally relevant therapy and counseling,
Yes.
healing spaces, right, is very important as well.
Yeah.
Um, we started PIK2AR 10, 12 years ago. I was a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault. My first abuser lived here in Salt Lake City. And when I came back here, it'd been 30 years, but I had been in a relationship that I was really, really um, undignified. Like, I was being beat up at the rugby game. Nobody would help me. People didn't know that I was Tongan or Samoan. They didn't know I carried my Palangi last name, so nobody really helped me. And I remember many times grabbing a man's leg and saying, "Please help me," and they would just shake me off. And so I was coming back to a lot of shame coming back here to Utah. And so I started looking for a culturally relevant uh, support group. And in 30 years, there wasn't anything here in Utah. And I was shocked with all the many Pacific Islanders that lived here, and we didn't have any culturally relevant services. So my husband and I went to a national Asian American Pacific Island domestic violence conference. And my husband came back from a breakout session and he said, you know, Susie, you women are not going to solve domestic violence by yourselves. Because the men are the larger number of abusers, men have to be involved in this movement. It will never be solved because we're the ones that are doing the most of the abuse. And so he, you know, my husband was like smoking, beer drinking. He owned a trucking company, was a truck driver, not the kind of guy to be doing community work. I was the one with the community work background, but I was really shocked that he wanted to do this. And so we had a big conversation about we don't just start stuff just because we're in this for the long haul if we're going to do this. And he said yes. He came back to Utah. He got the first group of men certified as Utah domestic violence advocates. There were 7 of them. And off they went. And the name of their group is K.A.V.A Talks, which stands for Knowledge Above Violence Always. And they started out in the K.A.V.A circles. And he tells me, because that's where all the abusers go. I was like, really? You men know that? He goes, yeah, we know that. He said, that's where we're going to go. And I'm just going to start the conversation about how, what is violence defined in America? And what does it look like? And is it helping our community? Is it helping our families? Is it helping our churches? And if it's not, we need to do something about it. And what are we men going to do about it? And so that was 10 years ago. Um, so they do a walk in the last week of April in St. George for Sexual Assault Month. They wear high heels, and the men walk a mile in
Oh,
high heels
in our shoes.
to, yes. So, and it's funny. Most people just come out because they think it's hilarious to watch Polynesian men, but
Uh-huh.
it's grown. We have all kinds of men, and some of the women want to come and wear high heels. But we started. It's called Heels to Heal,
Mm.
Heal to heal,
Oh, I love
and
it.
they
That's
do that.
nice.
So they do that at the end of April for Sexual Assault Month, and they do it in October in Salt Lake for Domestic Violence Month. And so they wanted to show that men were going to stand with women and we're going to be part of the solution. And, you know, their support in our women's empowerment group, because the men started and all women started calling, but they were calling about sexual assault. They
Mm.
weren't calling about domestic violence. And my husband said, well, you're a peer support, start another group. And I thought, this is supposed to be a men's organization. What am I doing? And then we started our women's empowerment group, and started providing resources. Now, every call we got was about incest. But the reason why I realized was domestic violence has been so normal in our communities that they didn't think it was a problem. So if you ask people, when we did a survey, a community assessment, and we asked the question, do you know anybody in domestic violence? The answer was no. But then the next or 3 or 4 questions we asked, do you know anyone that's been kicked, slapped, punched? The numbers were very high. So
Mm.
that told me that it had been normalized in our communities, and they didn't know it as domestic violence. They just
Yeah.
knew that as normal,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Which is sad. Um, and so that's how we got started doing it. It was really important as a survivor. I believe that a lot of us that work in this field, and maybe you know this and feel this too. I really wanted to be the person that I needed when I
Mhm.
was going through it, because I didn't have anybody to talk to. I didn't know anything about it. I just thought I was alone and I was just not good enough and he didn't love me because it was all my fault. I'm ugly, I'm dumb, all of that negative talk. Um, and I agreed why he was hitting me, because I wasn't a good wife. It took me a long, long time to work through all of that. Um, yeah, and so I feel like the best thing we can do is like what you're doing here, what you ladies doing here, and giving the platform. to helping women tell their story, because every time a story is told, somebody is influenced by it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you become part of their healing journey. And it's like, and so on and so on and so on, right? Um, and so you ask yourself, what is it that we need more of? More stories to be told, more empathy, more compassion, um, knowing the resources that are available in your area so that you can help people to safety. It is not easy work because not everybody learns the statistics says that women have to leave 7 times before they actually leave for good, right? Women aren't just going to leave. The chances are really slim we're going to leave the first time and never come back. That hope in us that we can make it work. We want to keep our families together. Um, is something that, again, I guess maybe it's our DNA that we want to keep our families together. It may be the religious layer that we have, is that families are supposed to be together, moms are supposed to put up with whatever, but moms are not supposed to put up with whatever. It is not God. It's not God's way for us to be mistreated like that. Heavenly Father doesn't want that to happen, and we shouldn't want that to happen. Um, so like we got like 5 minutes. This hour went by fast.
It did, yeah.
It did. I love how you got your husband involved, and then like how he said, like it's the abuser, or most of the times the abuser is the man, right?
Yeah.
So how do we fix it right through? Because it's one thing to try and guide the women through it and try and get them out of it and counseling and all these things, but you took it to the root to say let's go more upstream, like how you're saying in Utah, right? Start to the mountains, right? um I mean, thank you. Words aren't, saying thank you, mahalo, fafitai, all these things, because we also had one of our brothers from back home, our classmate, and he spoke up about it.
Yeah.
He spoke up about why he was so angry and why he bullied and, fought and drank and beat up, because we didn't know that at that time. But
Yeah.
he spoke up about what he went through, right?
Yeah,
And reaching out.
our men's group, I'm really proud of them. I went to it on Thursday night. It was standing room only. There was probably 35 men in there with
Yeah.
young. They'd brought their sons, and men that could get vulnerable. They could cry, right? And
Yes.
share their struggles. And we have men now in our community that have been sexually assaulted that will stand in a room of Polynesians and share their story. I never thought that I would see that in my lifetime. I thought our
Mhm.
men were too cool, too tough for
Yeah.
all,
Right? Yes,
right?
and he was courageous enough to share his story and to give hope and
Yeah.
to give younger people or whoever's listening to it, a way to say, like, go to the hospital, go to somewhere, the police, don't just go to the matai, or sometimes don't go to your parent, or because that's where they sometimes get swept under the rug, or but like you said, and the way that you break the chain, just as how you said, was these men are bringing their sons, right? They are involving to break that chain and generational curse, if I dare say that.
I mean, they're able to see communication, because we
Yeah,
let the young men check in and be part of that conversation. So they're sitting with Simi's, my husband is 73 to their dad's age, that's like 40, 30, and they're
yes.
sitting there, and at 10 years old, at 15, right? Um, and I think it's a beautiful thing. I think we just need to we hope that K.A.V.A Talks will grow and move to other cities. There are a lot of men out there that have reached out. I know without a shadow of a doubt that the suicide rates are normally tied to sexual assault,
Mm.
and because they can't talk to anybody else, the lack of communication, right? The
Yeah.
lack of words to say, and trusted adults for people to go to. So
Mhm.
I see that it's 1 minute, and I don't
um
want to take any time, but I would love the opportunity to come back another
Yes.
time, and we
yes, no,
continue
definitely.
this conversation, and maybe I can dive into more like the power and control wheel and get some education
Mhm.
around what domestic violence and sexual assault looks like. and on an educational um, way to help.
Next steps.
Yeah,
Yes,
next.
we have two comments on here. One is from Sincera. It says, the power of men from our Pacifica community taking initiative and accountability to be a part of the solution when it comes to abuse empowered me to just say out loud that I am a survivor. Hashtag powerful. And Julia says, Pulse of Polynesia is making a high impact on community and culture acceptance on these crucial conversations. Thank you, Leaso and Lena and team, for developing this platform to engage and share. Thank you.
Yes, it takes us all. It takes what I do. It takes what you guys do for us to really, when I ask myself, what are we going to do? This is what we're going to continue to do, right? Is
Yeah.
that that's how we're going to help our communities. That's how we're going to help ourselves and our children, the next generation, and break those chains um, and the trauma, right? I feel
Yeah.
like we didn't, I feel like I didn't go into deep, but I feel like we skimmed the top, and the next time around we'll go a little deeper.
Yes.
No, yes. Yo, like you said, there will definitely be a next time. And, I
Mhm.
wanted to thank you so much, myself. And, there are other points that you had bring. I love how you spoke about things and defined them and also brought in other points, because when people think domestic violence, like you said, some Polynesians, we think it's a normal day, right? We don't think of it as domestic violence. And then how you said that it starts from verbal. It starts from the little things, right? Up until isolation, until they can't control your mind and going all the way. And then it becomes the hands on. So
Yeah.
thank you for bringing that into light too. So for those that are listening that don't understand the process or think, this is normal, it's not. Thank you so much
You're
Yeah.
very
for
welcome.
sharing.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for your
So
time.
And then again, thank you so much, Susie, and everybody out there, and those who are going to tune in later. Please reach out to us to get Susie's information and her team. They are wonderful, and they will help you. They just helped another one of our guests that was on here recently, and so we're so blessed to have them, and we can't wait to have them again. So stay tuned to more information on that. And as always, to God be all the glory. Everyone have a good night and a happy Sabbath day. All right.
you
Again,
guys.
thank you, Susie. You guys
Hey.
have a good night.
Bye.
Bye.